There we go. We are recording. Hello and oh no, there. Hello and welcome once again. Welcome back, everybody. We are here today to celebrate World UFO Day and the Crypto Science Society's 16th birthday. In case you're not aware, the Crypto Science Society is a little student organization that I started with the help of my cousin back when we were attending college for our bachelor's at the Metropolitan State University of Denver way back in 2006. I really wanted to start a cult, but he talked me into doing this instead, so I'm glad I did. um, but all joking aside, no, it's evolved kind of beyond the student organization, and we're pretty much just an alliance of scholars and students dedicated to the study of strange and unusual phenomena. And we're happy to celebrate 16 years worth of doing it. Um, uh, World UFO Day today is an international kind of community holiday that was started to commemorate two things. One, the Kenneth Arnold sighting on in I think it was June 25th of 1947, and that same year, July 2nd, 1947, is the anniversary of the alleged Roswell crash that we all know and love, and we're going to be hearing a little bit more about that later today with a talk from my cousin and advisor, Alejandro Rojas. But I'm here today to talk to you about folklore as it applies to UFOs. So let me share my screen here. Heidi, do we need to do the entire screen or just a tab?
I chose the tab.
Tab. Okay, how's it looking to everybody? Can you see it? Hello?
Oh, beautiful.
Okay.
You can see it.
Cool. All right. So, UFO community is a vibrant and dynamic subculture that cross-populates between nationality, political affiliation, religion, generation, class, ethnicity, gender, education, and orientation. While there is substantial evidence to support the existence of UFOs as a reality, there is simultaneous lack of evidence to explain their origin. Despite these facts, and often in direct opposition to them, the UFO subculture has developed its own unique folklore and internal popular culture. Beliefs around the UFO phenomenon often show similarities to historical folk tales. Some cases echo specific themes, such as crossing into an otherworldly realm, encountering beings with fantastical abilities, time dilation, and more. In this talk, I will present a structural framework for active folk beliefs in the UFO community. I will show comparisons between contemporary and pre-modern interpretations of the phenomenon, and I will analyze the factors contributing to the evolving narrative. So, I would like to begin by explaining what I mean when I say folklore. Like many things, there are lots of misconceptions and misrepresentations about what folklore is and what it is not. If you are thinking that folklore is a Taylor Swift album, you would only have a piece of the puzzle and not necessarily one that exactly fits into the one we're trying to build right now. If you are also thinking that folklore is simply mythology, fairy tales, and urban legends, you would still be falling a bit short. In his book, Dynamics of Folklore, Bar Tolkien defines folklore through a breakdown of folk and lore, respectively. Folk derives from the German word das Volk, which means something like a genetically similar group, like the way ethnic group is used in English. Now, of course, we know that people can associate with various different and overlapping folk groups beyond ethnicity, and therefore, vernacular English expands folk to refer to just about any group of people with a common trait. Kinfolk, townsfolk, queer folk. That's all, folks. You get the idea. Lore indicates learning and knowledge. Folklore, then, is the learning and knowledge of a particular group of people. But it is not just passive. It is dynamic and performed and interacted with. It's what people do and how they do it. Think of it as microanthropology and a detailed study of beliefs. Who are the UFO folk? Well, we are. We are the UFO folk. Each of us falls somewhere on the spectrum of a believer and an open-minded skeptic, but we are all here because we are enthusiastic about the topic. So please bear with me as I reflect upon the folklore of our beloved friends and relatives, and I promise to be kind in my critique. UFOs are real. Even the most ardent skeptics have to concede at this point. According to the recent polls, close to half of Americans and Europeans believe that aliens have visited Earth. Most people generally associate UFOs and UAP with aliens. But what makes the UFO folk distinct? Most people who believe in UFOs and aliens generally approach the subject with a casual apathy. Meanwhile, the UFO folk have a highly enthusiastic relationship to the topic that is equally matched by true believers, objectives, and pseudo-skeptics alike. I mean, look at me. I'm doing this for fun. I spent a lot of time to take care of this because it's something that I'm passionate about. I'm genuinely interested. There are some other elements about things that people associate with UFOs and UFO folk. We have sort of developed our own narrative, our own folklore, and our internal popular culture. Core tenets of the UFO folklore revolve around a spectrum of belief or skepticism of a few key points. Number one, UFOs are alien spacecraft. Whether or not this is, yes or nay, the question is there and it is key, right? Same thing with aliens are abducting humans. The government knows all about it and they are hiding it from us. The phenomenon has been with us for all of human history. Some deeper lore tells of technology back engineered from downed spacecraft, interplanetary exchange programs, off-world officers, and even interspecies battles occurring in underground bases on Earth. Now, please note that the goal of this talk is not to dispute the validity of these beliefs, however far out they may seem, but it is simply to analyze and define them. For a great debate on that topic, I recommend going to UFO Twitter or YouTube and cancel all of your plans for the next few days. Bring a rope to help you find your way back out of the rabbit hole. In the meantime, we can discuss some of these beliefs and where they come from. Now, as I mentioned before, this year marks the 75th anniversary of the Kenneth Arnold sighting, an event that is acknowledged for ushering in the flying saucer and subsequent UFO era. Since then, countless reports, investigations, case studies, books, movies, songs, bands, record labels, festivals, conferences, TV shows, podcasts, and organizations have come about to contribute to the shaping of UFO folklore. The pop culture aspect is now a phenomenon all its own. So I want to allow just a moment for folks to chime in, and if Heidi, if you would manage the comments, but I'm just curious if anybody has any thoughts or comments on what we're showing here. I did obviously Blink 182, Aliens Exist, the song. We know how Tom DeLonge, most of us who are very well steeped in this know the involvement that Tom DeLonge specifically has had, again, in this weird sci-fi dystopian future that we're living in, with a rock star being instrumental in establishing all of these government programs that we just talked about, the release of information and coordinating with politicians. it's wild. It's insane. Never thought anything like that would ever happened. Roswell Records is the record label of Dave Grohl's Foo Fighters. Obvious reference to Roswell. Foo Fighters is another reference to the UFOs from World War II. And then Nine Inch Nails also. If you haven't listened to this album, it's called Year Zero. It's all about an alien, basically worldwide global alien visitation, basically revealing themselves. Here we are, and everything's how everything is going to change on account of it, basically. Anyway, moving on a little bit, as I mentioned, the pop culture aspect is a phenomenon all its own. Now, we also can identify these very key elements and motifs throughout history and culture. One particular aspect of the UFO lore I'd like to examine closer is that of abductions. For this, I refer to the work of Emily Zarka, Doctor of Philosophy and a faculty professor at Arizona State University. Dr. Zarka approaches literature and film through monsters, applying the theory that human history is monster history. She says that fiction imitates life, and life imitates fiction, and fiction imitates life in a perpetual cycle. Pop culture, current events, and cultural paradigms all influence folklore and vice versa. She outlines a specific formula present in most abduction cases. Observations of strange lights, some sort of object or craft. A person is taken, usually against their will, where they undergo traumatic physical examinations, which includes the reproductive system. Sexual activity between humans and non-humans may occur. The person is returned with fragments or partial memory of events. Often more time has passed than should have. Dr. Zarka points out that these elements seem highly influenced by popular science fiction movies and books of the mid-20th century. However, these same elements are also present in much older stories. In fact, there are references to disc-shaped flying objects and encounters with otherworldly beings throughout oral and recorded history. The extraterrestrial interpretation is actually fairly recent. Historical explanations include gremlins, elves, fairies, jinn, angels, demons, spirits, gods, etc. And we don't even have to go back very far to find them either. Within the last 200 years, a period showing the shift from pre-industrial society to a digital age, the interpretation of the phenomenon has evolved along with social changes. Oops. So first, we'll talk a little bit about dwarves. Many of you may be familiar with a short story by Washington Irving, published in a sketchbook in 1820. The Rip Van Winkle is set in Dutch culture of pre-Revolutionary War in New York State, and the main character of the story is Rip Van Winkle. It's based on a German folk tale. The German folktale version is after Peter Kraus, who is a goat herd. He comes across some little men playing a game in the woods, drinks some of their wine, and falls asleep for 20 years. There may be similar, and there are similar folktales throughout the world. Another example is the elves from the Brothers Grimm, circa 1830. Talks about a servant girl who is invited by elves to hold a child for them during its christening. After consenting, 3 elves come and conduct her away to a hollow mountain where the little folk lived. Everything there is very small, but elegant and beautiful, more elaborate than can even be described. Yet she describes it with ebony, black things adorned with ebony, black pearls, ivory, and gold embroidery. She sees the mother of the child in a bed, She stands over the mother holding the baby for its baptism by these elves. She's very uncomfortable with this, though, and she wants to go home. But the elves compel her to stay there for 3 days. The little folk did all they could to keep her happy. 3 days pass. They fill her pockets with money, lead her out of the mountain, directly back into her room, where her broom is still in the corner where she left it. She starts back to work, and strangers come out of the house asking who she is and what her business is there. And this is where she's learned that she was actually gone for 7 years and her masters have died. Now, this, for those of you familiar with the abduction phenomenon, this might bring some other, bring out some associations to some cases you might know of. One in particular is that of Travis Walton and the fire in the sky. Shown here, Travis and I at Red Rocks Amphitheater in Colorado, jokingly pointing out where to look to see the UFOs we decided were just there, joking around a little bit. But in all seriousness, Travis was abducted by a UFO on November 5th, 1975, while he was working in the Apache National Forest near Snowflake, Arizona. Walton was missing for 5 days and 6 hours. Travis reappeared by the side of the road near Heber, Arizona. The Walton case received mainstream publicity and remains one of the best known alien abduction stories. As it goes, the loggers encountered a strange craft hovering over the trees and went to go investigate it. When they got close, they could see it hovering above a clearing. Travis got out of the truck to get a better look. At that point, the craft moved and appeared to hit Travis with some sort of energy beam, knocking him down and rendering him unconscious. The loggers fled in fear, driving off into town, and reported what they had seen to the authorities, the local sheriff. The men were immediately suspected of murdering Travis and concocting a fanciful story to cover up what they had done. They were subjected to interrogation and polygraph tests, which determined that they were telling the truth. When Travis reappeared days later, he reported that he had woken up in a strange room. He was approached by small beings with big eyes and pale skin. He grabbed what he thought was some sort of metal pipe lying nearby and swung it at the creatures. They left, and he went off to explore his surroundings. He described that the atmosphere felt very thick and heavy. He felt a strange sensation in his chest, and he assumed that that had something to do with healing him after he'd been hit by the beam. He explored and found a sort of a control room, something he thought was a control room. A human-looking being met him and led him out of the craft in what looked like an airplane hangar. There he saw another saucer-shaped craft and met two other human-looking people who said he wasn't ready and put him to sleep. He then woke up on the side of the road with no idea how much time had passed. Now, another example of creatures, small creatures interfering and causing problems are goblins, kobolds, gremlins. These are small, mischievous creatures from mostly European folklore. They're human-like and about the size of a 4-year-old child. One legend recorded by folklorist Joseph Snow from a place called Alteburg in 1839 tells of a creature in the shape of a short, thick-set being, neither boy nor man, but akin to the condition of both. Garbed in a partly colored loose surcoat and wearing a high-crowned hat with a broad brim and diminutive head. There are numerous stories similar to this throughout the world, and but one remarkably and surprisingly recent story actually comes from a woman named Rosa Lotti in the Italian Alps in 1954. This picture here is depicting her encounter. Basically, she's a 40-year-old farmer who was walking on her way to church, and she saw this strange object parked on the side of the road. It was being tended to by these strange little men who harassed her and pulled at her clothes and took her flowers and gave her a rough, generally hard time. She got away and reported the story. Now, the airship flap of 1896 and 1887 is a very kind of a unique one that's juxtaposed against these stories, as they're it's a little different than what we kind of think of. Now, when I first started digging into this one, I had a different idea of it than I do now, and I'll explain why. Now, if you're not familiar, this was a situation where news reports originating in the western United States and spreading east, involving nighttime sightings of unidentified lights, but more detailed. There's a lot of detail in many of the reports. People described crewmen and pilots, but usually described them looking as human. It was popularly believed that the mystery airships were the product of some inventor who was not ready to make knowledge of his creation public. So much so, in fact, that Thomas Edison had to make a public statement declaring that it was not him behind it. Think of, he's the Elon Musk of his day. There's this weird thing going on in the skies. We're fairly familiar with a kind of a technology thing, and this is the guy who's doing all this really innovative stuff. That's the guy who we're going to assume is behind it. Now, most reports involved seeing a dirigible airships. A dirigible is a lighter than aircraft that is independently controlled and is propelled, unlike a hot air balloon that just kind of rides along with it. Now, this kind of thing was known at the time, despite some there's some people who tried to espouse it as it couldn't have been anything other than a UFO kind of situation, because people didn't know what dirigibles were yet then, and that's not true at all. However, some interesting things to point out is that the reports talked about them traveling at about 1,000 feet above the ground, which is very low. Civil aviation in the United States, for example, requires any aircraft operating in most airspace to be at least 2,000 feet up. So this is half the size of what you would see a small propeller plane flying around the city. They also were described as having lights on the underbelly, and witnesses even saw people on the deck operating machinery, such as pedaling up some kind of bicycle-like apparatus. Some heard voices shouting out orders to crew members. Others reporting the sound of singing as the craft passed overhead. And what is kind of interesting about that is the kind of comfortable nature of everything going on here. Now, it does get a little weird. One man encountered a landed ship and was approached by the occupants, who were 3 slender, 7-foot-tall beings who approached from the craft while emitting a strange warbling noise, and they tried to force him aboard. He refused, and they lacked the physical strength to overpower him, so they got back on the ship and left. An Arkansas man claimed that an airship pilot told him they were military bound for Cuba to kill Spaniards. 3 Texans claimed that they spoke to 5 peculiarly dressed men who asserted that they were descendants of the lost tribes of Israel and had come from the North Pole. The airship suddenly, there was another case where a ship appeared to have crashed and then suddenly disappeared, with a man standing where the vessel had been. The airship pilot showed the man a small device that supposedly enabled him to shrink the airship small enough to store the vessel in his pocket. Another appeared to be crewed by a beautiful nude woman and a bearded man, also nude, who pointed to the sky and uttered something that sounded like the word Mars. Finally, in Aurora, Texas, an airship hit a windmill tower, destroying the judge's flower garden and killing the pilot, who was clearly, quote, not an inhabitant of this world. A former Army signal officer was confident that he was from Mars. And the alleged Martian was given a proper Christian burial in the Aurora Cemetery. Now, there were, as I mentioned before, there were operational dirigibles at this time, and airships were definitely part of the common consciousness. So too were Martians, obviously, and the idea that they could be visiting us. What is key here is not whether or not these reports are true, but what these reports say about the cultural pulse of the witnesses and their projection of belief on what they were seeing and experiencing. There are also shades of the classical trickster motifs present, as well, if we take the witnesses at their word, at face value. Now, for some cultural context, you've probably noticed by now that all of these examples from here have been white, Anglo-American, European point of view, and therefore very Western-based cultural context. Western culture clearly defines categories of what is natural and what is not. In their book, Folkloristics, an Introduction, authors Georges and Jones explain that intellectuals of the 17th and early 18th centuries in Europe were committed to a mechanistic worldview. This means that the physical universe operates like a machine, constantly, repetitiously, predictably, and according to a set of mathematical principles and physical laws that are determinable and hence knowable and describable. Human beings are detached observers. Now, later on, an organic model was adopted, incorporating the human being as part of the overall organism, that is, the knowable universe. Now, when discussing UFOs and Fae, we are forced to ask the question, what is natural and what is not? Answering this question through the Western mechanistic lens, natural is anything physical, empirical, and measurable, as we're seeing so much attention to today. Through that same lens, the supernatural is the antithesis of natural and therefore intangible, ethereal, and often mysterious, frightening, uncomfortable, or undesirable. But not all cultures adhere to this model, such as indigenous traditions of the American Southwest. Applying these methods would be described, applying these methods would describe the indigenous worldview as a hyper-organic model. All that is seen and unseen is part of nature. Therefore, nothing is supernatural. So that brings us to the Navajo Rangers. John Dover and Stanley Milford are federal law enforcement officers who are charged with protecting tribal lands on behalf of the Navajo Nation. Along with their regular duties, they are assigned to officially investigate and document significant cases involving Bigfoot, hauntings, witchcraft, and UFOs. The Navajo Rangers are the only law enforcement agency in any nation with an official mandate to investigate the unexplained in this way. John Dover says that so many people encounter things on the reservation that it's a fact of life. Milford says that although there are variations between different tribal stories, things passed down hold many similarities. The reservation is a very insular community. People communicate among themselves but rarely share with outsiders. And they both have spent more than 20 years doing this work and have numerous fascinating stories to tell. One story describes an elder who had called about a craft that had landed by his house. He was annoyed by the presence of the occupants and went out to confront them. Now, according to Stanley Milford, the Navajo language does not have a word for alien. And this elder referred to these beings as small children. When he went out to confront them, he tripped on a stone and broke his flashlight. It was at this point he saw the beings go into the craft and then floated away. Now, elders are very culturally respected, and his report was taken seriously. He was clear-minded and coherent, and he retold the story numerous times over many years, and no details ever changed, in keeping with the strict oral tradition of the Navajo people. We can really dig into an interpretation of his encounter through the way it's described. Now, although the story itself is simple, the language used makes some very interesting points. As Milford stated, there is no word for alien in the Navajo language. However, there are Navajo speakers who say there are words for spaceship and alien. And there is one that kind of talks about it most indigenous folks have ways to describe someone who is not them. One is either one of us or you are not, right? You are either Dene or you are not Dene. I'm in the process of sorting out whether or not this is the case here. And it's also important to note the insular nature of the Navajo Nation. You know, things, even though it's a globalized society, not a lot goes in and out in this kind of context. Now, the point here is that the elder described these beings as children and not as aliens, and did not try to distinguish the beings in the craft as not Dene. So there are lots of stories about tricksters and other entities, all with their own names and descriptions. So it's just fascinating the way that this plays out, and I'm really interested to dig into it a little deeper. Now, that said, from a contemporary UFO reports to historical fairy lore and enduring indigenous traditions of the Dene people, we can see some common themes describing the phenomenon, with interpretations of whom may be behind it being influenced by cultural context of the observers. To quote Dr. Zarka again, the shift from fairy abduction motifs and supernatural encounters to more technologically based extraterrestrial reports could be attributed to emerging technologies and cultural movement away from superstitions. As science and technology advance and our understanding of the universe expands, our concept of what constitutes life does as well. Science fiction helps us to imagine the philosophical, practical, and moral implications of real encounters between aliens and humans. An intellectual testing ground, cloaked in the trappings of fantasy to make it more desirable. And in exploring these hypothetical scenarios, we question what it means to be human. In other words, the way we depict aliens is often more about us than them. Folklorist and author Piper C.J. notes that the presence of similar stories from different cultures throughout the world and throughout history is evidence of it as a tangible reality. The exact nature of what it is remains mysterious, and interpretation of it depends highly upon the cultural paradigm of the observer. And I kind of hope that it remains mysterious for a little longer. Thank you.
Nice job, Jason. That's some good stuff.
Thank you. Yes. And yeah, I seen this flooding in the comments real quick, like so steampunk. Yeah, that airship flap is straight up steampunk pirate, some kind of mad scientist off doing what they're doing. A lot of people have kind of discounted it as just kind of like a newspaper hoax, like that it was generated by a. Oh, am I still sharing my screen?
You are still sharing your screen,
Oh,
yes.
let me share myself. How's that? Can you see my face now?
Jason is now sharing himself. No, I just see your
There it is. Oh, okay. Come back. There we go. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, there's been some discounted, but again, it comes back to that kind of folklore element. Like it's something in the consciousness, like planted there, and it's reciprocating, right? So, and I find it really interesting too, like that it's very playful, right? It's a very kind of mischievous thing going on. So I don't want to. I've talked quite a bit though, but like I do, there's so much that can be said about this. So I'm happy to entertain any questions.
So do you think that it just uh could all these little beings be aliens, extraterrestrials, but as we evolve as a society, they evolve into what the experiences are? Or do you think that there are, like, these people are legitimately having all these different experiences with all these different type of paranormal entities, if
Yeah,
that's what
that's a
you want
great
to call
question.
them?
I honestly, I don't know. But I think the way that my personal beliefs have evolved are moving away from aliens, right? Like I know in my heart of hearts, right, there has to be alien life out there, right? But as far as the evidence has presented itself, it doesn't. It's not showing it that way. What is showing is that there's something that's been here with us forever, right? It's as much a part of us, or at least Earth, as we are. So it raises the question for me, then why isn't it, what if it's more terrestrial than we ever imagined,
Right.
right? Even the UFO thing, right? My personal thought is, there's this weird thing. What is, and Jim and I were kind of talking about this before. My own, I refer back to a book by Ivan T. Sanderson, who I believe it was called the the Uninvited. I have to go back and get that reference, but basically he proposes this idea: what's the most offensive thing to the human ego? Not that there are aliens out there, not that there's another competing intelligence from another world, but that other competing intelligence is from this one. That we're not the apex, we're not the number one game here in town. That what if there's another type of being, some kind of intelligence that is advanced in a way that we just cannot comprehend, demonstrating some of these energetic abilities, kind of going in between physical and incorporeal kind of manifestations, and that we just are so far behind that we can't understand or interact with them. So it's I kind of lean, whatever that is, what if that's the case? And then of course it would be, I think that's the cultural thing that would be very difficult, at least for the patriarchal Western culture mindset to digest. Like,
Right.
what do you mean we're not? We're
Yeah.
not the
The
we're not.
ocean is a big place.
The
And
ocean is big, yes, and life in the ocean has had millions of more years ahead of us land dwellers to evolve and develop.
yeah. And there's so
So,
many reports of the, like, weird orbs, like, going into the water in
right,
lakes.
yep,
I've seen one in Arizona lake, like this, light balls, or I don't know what you want to call them. It's just weird, man.
So here's a question. So I would taking a clue from the indigenous peoples who call them star people, um, and don't necessarily think of them as earth elementals. Um, I just so I guess there's no question there. I'm just kind of pointing that out that they think of them as star people.
I would like to add to that and clarify. Make sure that you are, um, whenever you talk about whenever we talk about indigenous things, um, it's very careful. It's important to make sure that you're getting your information from a reliable source. In that case, an indigenous person or an indigenous scholar themselves. Um, the the star people thing is kind of uh, a little bit crunchy. I'll just call it crunchy.
Fair enough.
In the sense of like, it's often when you see stuff about star people in media, it's often, the source is often a white person talking about what these Native people are doing. Now, that said, there are traditional stories referring to something like that. However, there's a lot of cultural leaps, or like kind of speculative leaps, that often take place. I'm not saying that it's not there. I want to say that it's really important to just be mindful of it, right? And just make sure that it's coming from the right source.
That's a very good. So Discovery Channel is not necessarily the most reliable, right?
I would cross-reference a few things.
Right.
Yes. Anything from the Discovery Channel, for sure.
That's a good point. Thank you for that.
You're welcome. Yes. I see a lot of stuff going on in the chat, and I'm not able to catch it all. I hope.
What if what if it's just in page mentions, yes, what if it's just interdimensional beings, but from dimensions that exist on Earth, and maybe they are able to cross over dimensions?
Sure. Yeah. Interdimensional travel is certainly a thing. And again, Jim and I were kind of talking about this before, this idea, kind of that technological mindset, right? So we go from fairies to aliens to now interdimensional, right? Now that the public consciousness, the psyche is now more trained to, we see movies and stuff about interdimensional, like, Doctor Strange, like there's a whole thing about the multiverse. So now more people are talking about, like, well, yeah, I get aliens, but what if it's even further? Like, whoa, bro. Right? What if it's interdimensional? And honestly, those kinds of things have been proposed. Even Lou Elizondo, I believe, maybe officially, unofficially, there's been, at least he's been heard saying that his personal opinion is that there's probably something going on with multiple universes, interdimensionality, something like that. So, and Lou Elizondo, for those who aren't aware, he was the former director of ATIP, the government's $20 million Pentagon program that has now been replaced by the UAP task force, and so on and so on. So I believe he's got some things he knows what he's talking about.
It's possible.
It's entirely possible. Possible that he knows what he's talking about?
Michelle wanted to say great. I can't read. Great talk, Jason. I remember we talked about it sometimes, and it's always interesting to hear that the concept of natural is problematized and does not apply to non-Western contexts. And the way they perceive and describe the non-natural experiences changes too, accordingly.
Yeah. It's a really fascinating topic, and I think I really appreciate the folklore influence to be giving me this perspective, because I my bachelor's is engineering, so I've come at it from a very nuts and bolts point of view. And when my cousin and I first started going to MUFON meetings, and we're sitting in these talks, and I remember being frustrated, like, yeah, I get it, okay, UFOs are real, I'm there, but what? Like, let's break it down. Like, how are they powered? Who's driving them, and how are they doing it? Right. I'm still looking to answer those questions. And I feel like the chasing the nuts and bolts trail for the past 20 years has not gotten me much farther. But I think we're moving towards a better understanding with a more holistic view.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. Jim asks, what is Alejandra's background?
What do you mean by background? As in education, or
Jim is shaking his head
Yeah,
yes.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
or
I mean,
our
like
shared
you come from an
DNA?
engineering background. What is his, you
He's a
know?
journalist
Oh,
and
okay.
a psychology major. I think he started out as a psych major, and he ended up switching over to journalism. So
Okay. Cool.
that's why Open Minds is so good, because he's a hard hitting journalist,
Hmm.
and he knows how people think.
They don't.
Or the ones that do think, at least, I guess, right?
Some of them, some do more than others. Or, I hear a lot of people will say, smart people do dumb things.
It's true.
Yeah, we all make our mistakes.
Yeah.
Uh,
How do you get around it? You don't.
yeah. Well, you learn from them. You
Yeah.
learn from them, and make the world a better place. Speaking
Yeah.
of Alejandro, I am trying to see if he's probably getting bombarded by all those UFOers down in Roswell. Uh,
Right.
so he's getting bombarded with questions. So we can um, we can keep talking until I hear from him. But and I open it up. People.
Yeah. Everybody else, pop on.
We
It's an
are
open thing. Cyrus, what happened to you?
again. We are not hierarchical here.
No.
Everyone has a voice. Everyone can contribute.
Well,
That's
I was fascinated that you were mentioning, the dirigibles and all those, machines that, because I mentioned earlier that I was reading Jacques Vallée's Dimensions, and he talks a lot about that era and those machines. And I mean, I just kind of thought, this somebody's smoking crack here. But then you come on and start talking about the same thing. That's the first I had ever heard about that, and then that was just like 2 days ago, and then here you are talking about it.
mm,
So that's
adventures in synchronicity.
yes.
Man, we should like build one of those for for like Burning Man or
The
that
synchronicity
other
machine
that steampunk thing. I'll
or
get
the
up there in my
airship.
electric
Yeah.
yeah. I'll be up there in my electric violin all Mad Max style, right?
Oh, hell yeah, that would be fantastic.
Just freak everybody out.
How hard could it be, right?
Right. I don't
Okay. Yeah, Klaus Okamati, Nimani, and Leroy, thanks for coming.
yeah, keep up the research.
Yeah, we're gonna hit up. We're working on a lesson plan for Bigfoot.
All right.
It'd be awesome.
Yeah, you should get my daughter involved in that because she's all into it. All 8 years old.
Mm. Oh, yeah. So, yeah, totally. We've got different age levels. I will coordinate with you. Yeah.
Oh
So
yeah.
there's
Could
there's
be
the
a
younger
thing.
bracket. Nimani went through the younger bracket, so it's like sixth grade, fourth, fifth, sixth grade ish, and then now we're working on the kind of middle school level. He's going to be spearheading that, piloting that program for us. So yeah, we'll connect on that.
That's
Oh, excuse
awesome.
me.
Yeah, it could be a
Real quick.
thing for all of our children, all of us weirdos children, right?
Yeah, absolutely. If any of you in the feed here have kids and want to get get down with some junior investigator training, hit me up. We've got something for you too. All ages, everybody, all inclusive. Except haters. We don't like hate here.
Right. Yeah.
Um, so yeah. So real quick before I end recording, I just want to shout out a couple quick ones. Oh, I wanted to do my. It's going to take too long to get it. Anyway, so we are again. We are the Crypto Science Society. We are everywhere. You can find media, YouTube, Facebook. We've got to help you find everything. just go to our link tree, which is linktree.com/paracryptology. I'll drop that in the chat right here, and I'll
It's
put it in
also
the
in your
description.
bio, right? Of your
Yeah,
Instagram.
yeah, it's on the bio. I'll drop it in the link tree, and it'll be in the bio when this makes it onto YouTube. So look us up as paracryptology, because we're all inclusive. So once again, thank you for your attention and being here.
Yeah. Thank you. That